Welcome to the Gen X experience, where two Gen X black men dive deep into the heart of politics, social action shaping our world today. I'm Mr. Perspective, your host, bringing you the critical insights and thought-provoking viewpoints you crave, along with my co-host, the preacher teacher, J. Rob, here to break down complex issues with wisdom and clarity, making sure he leaves no stone unturned. Today, we're going to get right into this podcast, but before we do so, don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay locked into us. J. Rob, how are you feeling today, my brother?
Feeling great this morning. Thank you. Once again, people, please like and subscribe. Thank you for joining us. Right? Let's get right into it.
All right. So this is all over the news, all over the press, just everywhere on the highest topic in politics right now. Should President Biden step aside? Preacher teacher, help us out.
My short answer is yes. I think the polling is quite clear. With his diminished capacities to get out on the campaign trail with the vigor that's necessary under the circumstances, it is practical for the president to step aside. Is that going to happen? No. President Biden is too proud. Typically, men or women in any case who get to this pinnacle of the political world, their egos are too large to allow themselves to quit. That is their strength as well as their weakness. So should he resign for practical purposes? My personal belief is yes. Will he resign? Reading the tea leaves? No.
And I think that is one of the things that's becoming more and more clear. It has to be his decision, and there isn't much space to force him aside. But before I get into that part of the conversation, I'm going to say this. It's hard for Joe Biden to step aside when we look at the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is full of leadership is full of 70-plus-year-old fossils who are looking at Joe Biden saying, you step aside. Imagine Pelosi talking about step aside. Imagine. And he like, what? Look at you. You know, we just had the passing of Sheila Jackson Lee. She's 74.
Pelosi did step aside.
Oh yeah, she did when she left the podium. No, yeah, that's a great point. You're right. Thank you for that. That really does cut off my my number one argument. So will he step aside? I don't think so, and I don't think it's just about pride. It's also about being just stubborn, right? And willing to go your own way. He fought so hard to get here, a place that he never thought he would be. And because he was the young man in Congress for so long, and the next one up, his number never came up. And because of that, and because of him facing that, I don't think he will step aside, but he can be forced to step aside, right? And that is the key thing that we're talking about right now. I saw a video of him from 4 years ago, and the difference in contrast to the energy and the vigor in which he spoke, the clarity in which he spoke just 4 years ago is drastic. And that's what a lot of people are seeing. Even in this image, he's aged so much than, the typical 3 years. And people say this all the time. They say the cognitive decline, it can happen in a day. And once that thing changes over, you're there, right? And I think, okay, so let me ask you this. Should the Democratic Party go as far as, if he refuses to step down, and force him to step down through legal channels in terms of invoking, the 25th Amendment, if I'm not mistaken?
Well, there's a difference between the 25th Amendment, which is a legal process, and the Democratic National Committee attempting to change the selected nominee. One's a legal process, one's a political process. In terms of the nomination, which is the cogent point here, there is no mechanism to force him to step aside. And as we speak, based on what I'm seeing on X, um, the National Committee is moving to certify the delegates and for Biden at this particular moment. And so it seems as if he survived the pressure that was put on by the leadership in the party.
So when you talk about pressure, and we heard this earlier in the week, that the donors were also a big part of this conversation and leading for this change, saying like, look, we're going to freeze the money. And if that happens, it would be impossible to run, because we all know, unfortunately, campaign reform never happened, and the people who are actually in charge of pushing candidates forward are the donor class, the people who could donate $10 million at a drop of a hat, and not necessarily the common people who voices sometimes get silenced in these type of situations. So what's the next step for Biden in terms of, what happens if he steps aside?
Yeah,
what does that mean?
How does he resolve that problem with the donors?
Yeah.
I think that's the reason why you're seeing a strong push from the DNC to certify the delegates and move past this discussion of him stepping aside, because the money started to dry up. And so I think once a nominee is certified, and at this point it looks like it's going to be the president, those donors have nowhere else to go with their money. And so I don't think they're going to completely sit out the remainder of this election cycle, because it wouldn't be to their advantage in terms of pushing those issues that had them donating the money in the first place. Is it going to be an effective strategy? Again, this is why I think Biden should step aside, because you're going to have a reluctant donor class, and so the money may not be as much. And with the attempted assassination on former President Trump, I think the donor class on the right is probably a little bit more motivated, and so I think it's going to be important. Another reason why I thought that it would be good for him to step aside is because it could generate some excitement. I think the Republican strategy is to bring out their base, and I think that should be the Democrat strategy as well. Really, we're only talking about convincing a handful of voters, metaphorically speaking, that are undecided. And so I think the side that does the best job of convincing their base to turn out and to vote is probably the side that's going to win. So Biden still has a shot, but what is he personally going to do to excite the base and bring them out? I'm not quite sure.
When you talk about exciting the crowd, we saw the poll number. The polls have been coming out. Everybody's running polls, so many polls, different polls out. All those polls show Biden as, a historic mandate, actually, that Trump will get if elected, according to the polls right now. And I think, if anything, for the Democratic Party, they have to stop it from being a mandate, even if they don't win. If he comes out emphatically and it's across the board, and also the Republicans take the Congress, it's a big deal. I'm not sure if things will go them taking the Congress. I know that's a little bit more difficult. But what I'm saying is, if Donald Trump gets a mandate, holy hell.
Well, for Donald Trump, I don't think he needs so much of a mandate as a victory, because if he gets a victory, for him, that is a mandate. If you look at the numbers in terms of the general election, a Republican has not won a general election since George W. Bush, his second term. And so it's been quite some time. Even with his record number of votes, Donald Trump still lost to President Biden because he received an even larger number of votes. And so it would be a remarkable thing to see a Republican candidate, especially a Donald Trump, beat a Democratic candidate in terms of the general election. I think their goal specifically has been in terms of, to win the Electoral College, which favors, the numbers seem to favor them in that regard at this point. And so, I'm not quite sure about Trump's mandate, but it doesn't matter.
What I'm saying is the numbers are so close based on...
He's going to call it a mandate, whether or not if he won by one vote, it's going to be a mandate. So that's all he needs. So I'm not disagreeing. I'm just in the traditional sense, it wouldn't be a mandate, but under Trump, it's a mandate. It's either a mandate or it's rigged. So one or the other. So.
Hey, listen, Biden got a record number of votes, right? So I'm just saying ballot box stuff and all that good stuff.
Well, I tell you what, if that's the case in 2020, then he should be a lock in 2024 because he's an incumbent president, and quite frankly, if he was able to rig the election outside of the government, then that speaks more to Trump's incompetence because he was an incumbent in 2020. So if he allowed the Democratic candidate to rig the election while he was in office, then maybe he shouldn't be president again.
Well, I mean, he did have the Republican Party standing firmly against him versus having the MAGA Party standing firmly with him. And I think that could make a big difference. One of the interesting things is, too, when we look at Biden stepping aside, right? And I think the consensus is he should from many different parts, but I think the consensus within his family, and specifically, you know, they've been talking about how Black Democrats, and especially the Black leadership class, have been Biden's firmest advocates. You know, this being the Gen X experience from the Black perspective. What are your thoughts on the support that Biden gets from the Black representatives, from the Black public? Is it about him or is it about the Democrats, period? What are your thoughts?
The support Joe Biden has received from the Black community has been about Joe Biden. He was Barack Obama's vice president for 8 years. And so he did curry some favor with the Black community during that time. He played his role well as an attack dog for President Obama. And he was known prior as a senator from Delaware. And so the older Black community is comfortable with him. The younger community that came on board the Democratic Party as fans of Barack Obama are also familiar with him. However, this time I think it's a little bit different. I think what happened, and this is just conjecture on my part, I think what we've witnessed here in the Democratic Party is there was some inclination or some indication from parts of the leadership that they were willing to take a look at someone else other than the Vice President Kamala Harris as a potential replacement at the top of the ticket for Joe Biden. And that is where the African American community stood up inside the Democratic Party and said, no way, Jose. And so what I think we're seeing here is, much as President Biden earned favor from the African American community for his service to President Obama for 8 years as vice president, Kamala Harris has earned respect from the women and the Black community inside of the DNC for her service to Joe Biden in 4 years. And you remember initially she was outspoken. They sent her out and she was criticized for her remarks. And since that time, she has played her role as a side chick, for lack of a better term.
No, that's a perfect term for Kamala Harris.
Well, that's what the vice president is. I mean, Biden played that part.
Role.
Right. The vice president is a side chick, right? Let's be real about it. But she's played that role, metaphorically speaking, that is.
No, she's actually played that role.
She's no, because she went from the side chick to the main chick. Let's give her credit if you want to go there now. Don't do Kamala like that. She's one of the few women that actually capitalized on her and Hillary Clinton. And so if you look at Melania Trump, now she is really the side chick from. As a matter of fact, Melania chick. No, let me stop, man. We messed up the podcast.
Yeah, go for it. Let's get back on track. Don't forget, that's for later. We need to get to 100 subscribers before we go off topic like that. So if you want to get the full conversation, stay locked in.
Is that fair to the man? Is it fair to President Biden to ask him at this juncture of his political career, his life, he's in the twilight? I think it's safe to say, not just in terms of his political career, but also his life. Is it fair to ask him to step aside when he's earned the right to, as an incumbent president with a successful record, to run again? Is that fair?
For me, I would say for the Democratic Party, it's about the party and it's not necessarily about the man, right? It's about the institution. So, in preservance of the institution, I would say yes. And you just can't, and that's the great thing about being part of the institution, is that your legacy lives on through that, and through that process. And so with that being said, I think there's nothing wrong. Like you said, you corrected me earlier. If Pelosi can let go of the reins of power, you know what I mean, a little bit and step aside, because she was the power broker within the Democratic Party. That when the party was lined up and in line, she was at the head of this. Because I imagine if Pelosi was still in charge, we would not be having this type of division in the Democratic Party, right? So it just shows you the strength of leadership. But she, despite that, did step aside. So with that being said, I think it's safe for the Democrats to ask Biden to step aside. And it is fair because of his mental state.
I agree. I think if you look at it from an emotional standpoint, then you might come away thinking that may be a little bit unfair to Joseph Biden as a person. But also from a legacy standpoint, I think the president is in danger of ruining his legacy. If he loses this election and Donald Trump is able to enact much of the perceived agenda, then the legacy of Joe Biden is going to be that he refused to let go of the reins at a time when he had an opportunity to give his party a shot to prevent Trump from taking power. And so, but at the same time, if he were to somehow pull it off, then I think that too would be a great story. Although I think there still would be some question about his ability to perform. You touched on earlier about diminished capacity. And, I think that's true. What happened in the debate is Joe Biden appeared to be diminished in terms of his ability to convey the message that he so skillfully articulated for so many years on the Hill. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. And on a human level, you don't have to be a political expert to understand that we're witnessing a person who doesn't have the same ability that they had 6 months ago, let alone 6 years ago when he was vice president for Barack Obama. And so unless he's able to, once he gets over this bout of COVID, and we're wishing the president well in that fight in isolation, if he's able to come out and demonstrate some vigor, then perhaps he can quiet, the questions surrounding his candidacy. But personally, my experience has been, once you see a person diminished in terms of their ability, whether it's because of age or disease, it's unusual for them to regain their ability to the level that they were prior to.
So was Kamala Harris, specifically for Joe Biden, the person, the best pick ever? Because if they had somebody who they had more confidence in to lead the way, because her polling numbers, talking about polling numbers, as bad as Biden polling numbers are, Kamala Harris polling numbers are worse in terms of her.
Well, she's actually, what I've heard, I don't have anything in front of me, so you can check me on this. But what I've heard is she's actually polling slightly better than Biden, specifically in some of the swing states. But again, the only justification for her candidacy at this point would be an attempt to generate some excitement and perhaps bring out more of the base, with the idea of the first female president. But I think it's a tough haul, which is the reason why Biden has survived so far.
I talked about this a little bit last time, and I just got to reiterate this. I think they knew more than what they said they knew. A year ago, they were talking about even Pierre Jean-Claude Van Damme. She was saying on the podium,
you did not do this. Corinne St. Jean Pierre, I believe is her name, correct?
Jean-Claude Van Damme. So she even said on the podium that they've had specialists seeing him for over a year, at least a year. I don't know if it was more, but she admitted to a year specialist coming in to measure where he was mentally, right? And whether he passed those tests or not, I think it says a lot that they brought him in, right? And because of that, and this is, like I said, I think this is the second biggest screw up that the Democratic Party has had in recent years. First, the number one thing they had was in 2016 when they forced Hillary down on the people, because the people were ready for a change, and the change was, the country was. We were just at that epoch of time. So it was either going to be Donald Trump or it was going to be Bernie Sanders, right? And those were the two candidates that were able to galvanize the people the way they were. Those traditional candidates was not going to move the people, and they did not move the people, right? So, but the Democrats used their delegates, used their convention, used their committee to push Hillary forward, all right? And she lost. The Democratic Party had an amazing opportunity with RFK Jr. versus Kamala Harris conversation to take place. And they pushed Biden on the people. And we never got any of the debates. And I think that was a big mistake. And I think it's their own fault that they're here right now today on the precipice of what could be a historic defeat.
I'm not sure if I follow you about the RFK Jr. Kamala debate. Are you referring to the 2016? I mean, 2020?
No, I'm talking about for in 2022, if they would have allowed him to step aside earlier, if they would allow for a primary earlier, if they would have allowed for that because they knew about the cognitive decline.
Right.
Because they knew something was happening. I'm not saying it was full go where it's at today, but because they had those specialists in, they knew. They can't run away from that because they admitted it for at least a year they've known.
Yeah, I think that would have taken, if it were the case that the president had been diagnosed with some significant cognitive decline, and it was obvious that he should resign the office, I think that it would have taken a type of courage and humility from his advisors that is difficult to imagine. You don't get to that position without a certain amount of reverence, respect, and fear, for lack of a better term, from the leader. And so I think there are very few people who could have spoken to the president and frankly said to him that he needs to resign if that were the case. I think those people being his wife, Dr. Jill Biden, Nancy Pelosi, former Speaker of the House, and former President Barack Obama, just a couple that I could think of. However, we are unsure if that is the case. I think more than anything else, what we can safely say is that much like many of our parents, grandparents, the others in our family, we've witnessed a decline in President Biden that's obvious. And that is the reason why I called it back on July 2nd. I said that President Biden is either going to step aside or he's going to lose the election. I posted that on Facebook on July 2nd. So I'm going to stand by that at this particular point. And it's because you don't have to be a political junkie to see him speak and know that he's a person that should probably consider, what's best for their future at this point.
But I guess I'm with you on that. And I think that's what's annoying for the Democratic Party when they talk about how important it is or this or that, this election, because it wasn't important to you. They saw whatever they saw and they rolled the dice. The media, right before the debate, they were running it down our throat that he was fine. He was fine. He was fine. He was fine. Right? Even though we saw how much he's declined. We saw the stumbling. We saw the speech. We saw his physical image decline significantly, which we all knew it's a hard job, right? Nobody declines more in those 4 years than the president, right? And like I said, they tried to roll the dice, and it looks like they're going to crap out.
Well, remember, he did give a passionate State of the Union address where even the Republicans, I had to backtrack from some of their criticisms about, his abilities, which they were on too heavy. You're right. For some time, the right on social media has been attacking President Biden's capacities for quite some time, but he did step up. But I think the thing is much like, a grandparent or an elderly parent, they have their moments where they are lucid and they are themselves, but those moments are far and fewer in between as time goes on. And so my concern is the young person who looks at President Biden, who may support his policies or may not, but they see an older person that they don't believe is going to be fit for the fight for their future, and therefore they're not enthused to go out and vote. And so the election may pass and they're like, wait a minute, was I supposed to vote yesterday? Because they're not excited about it. Where a Kamala Harris candidacy with her choice as a vice president could flip the age question very swiftly on Donald Trump, who himself is knocking on 80's door.
They talk about the donor class and where they stand. I just feel so uncomfortable with the fact that so much of the election is dominated by money, right? It's not really about policy. It's about messaging. It's about promotion. And a lot of that messaging comes through the media. It comes through paying influencers to promote your message. And it's not coming from a place of how are you advocating for the people. And the fact that we're here, where the donors play such an important part of where does the money go, right? Let's say you thought Gretchen Whitmer was the best person to do the campaign, right? The Democratic National Committee, or the legal process of, can't switch it over because of the money. If they think like, you know what, as we stand today, the best person we can put forward to for a presidential nominee is, I don't want to say Kamala Harris, because the only reason I'm not saying her name because that's an easy transition, right? Because she's already part of the ticket. But let's say they did believe that Gavin Newsom was the best person for their party to represent their party's interests. They can't do it because of the money. And that doesn't sit right with me. How do you take that, that topic?
Well, again, I don't think it's so much because of the money. I think there's some time constraints if you switch candidates other than Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris would be able to run on the Biden record, so to speak. And so she could highlight the record unemployment for African Americans, the reduction in inflation, the record number of jobs, the record economy, the record stock market. She could argue those things as a vice president who was a part of the administration that brought that about. Whereas Gavin Newsom would have to run on his record in California, which is a highly liberal record. And I think would perhaps, although he's articulate and is a very good debater, I think his record in California would the conservatives and the GOP and the MAGAs, they would welcome an opportunity to critique his record from California. And so Gretchen Whitmer is another potential candidate who was mentioned as a possible running mate with Kamala Harris, to have a women on both two women on the ticket, which I think would be a strong argument, but also because she comes from a swing state. And so, again, I don't think it's the donors, because I think once we have a solid candidate and nominee, rather, the donors are going to come back because there's nowhere else for them to go.
All right. You kind of said this earlier. What's next for the DNC? Well, let's kind of project a little bit. What will the Democratic National Convention look like? Because right now it looks like a party that's in disarray with no leadership. We were just talking earlier about a tweet from Jamie Harrison, who was saying like, look, we just need to stop attacking each other, just get behind Joe Biden and keep pushing forward. And this is the leader of the DNC. And I wonder, why is he tweeting that out? Why does that have to be a message that's not behind closed doors and leading the party? Is he even the leader of the party? Is there any leadership when it looks like, objectively speaking, it looks like the leader of your party has to send out a tweet to the people in the party, the leadership of the party, not just the people, but the leadership of the party, versus, having those behind closed doors meeting that you see the unity, because we don't see that right now. What are your thoughts on what does the convention look like for the Democrats?
Well, I think the convention is going to go one or two ways. If they push forward with the Biden nomination, I think it's going to be bland. I think it's going to be unexciting. And I think the poll numbers are going to continue to shift towards former President Trump. While there is a certain level of confusion to a convention without President Biden as the presumptive nominee, I think that would create a lot of intrigue and excitement and a level of focus that a President Biden nomination just simply is not going to engender. And so I think the Democrats' best hope, and this is why I keep making the argument, it's not a personal favorite of mine, but I keep making the argument that Biden should step aside, is because there is no excitement with his candidacy. And I think that is the reason why the chairman of the DNC has felt the need to speak so strongly. I think number one is because they're seeking to bring an end to this confusion. Let's get back on track with the nominee so that the donors again can start opening up the coffers so that money can flow. I think there's a real fear that the operations in the near future would begin to suffer if the finances aren't handled correctly and that issue is not resolved promptly. But I think the other reason why you see Chairman Harrison speak so forcefully is because the absence of the president. The president is the de facto leader of his political party. And because of Biden's health and his diminished capacities, I think he is at this particular juncture unable to do the work that is necessary for him to bring everybody into the fold. I think traditionally you would have seen a president who was working the phones, who was taking visitors, who would have been convincing members of his party that they should be on board with him, that they're, especially an incumbent president with the record that Biden has. I think it speaks to his weakness politically that others are having to step into in his steed and make the argument for him, along with the fact that he's suffering from COVID. And I do want to wish him a speedy recovery, just like we said for President Trump, former President Trump. Just on the human level, COVID is a very serious health issue, especially for the elderly. And being in isolation at this particular time is something that I'm sure is not good for him in terms of his mental health. At the height of his political career, at a crucial moment, he's in isolation. So we wish you the best, President Biden. Get healthy so you can come out here and prove me wrong and bring the fight to this candidate that seemingly should be a knockout, but it's turning out to be different. So
no, one of the things is I hope he gets better too, because when he suffers his defeat, I think he should be doing it standing on his 2 feet, right? I don't want no TKO. You know what I mean?
Well, I remind you what you said about people who made the comments about President Trump. That's low hanging fruit.
No, I'm saying I don't want him to be sick. I don't want it to be a TKO. I want him standing on his feet. I
understand what you meant.
I'm not saying I want him to, you know what I mean?
I know full well what you meant.
Yeah. I want him on his feet. I want him back and out there, right? Because we don't need it. That's what I'm saying. We don't need it on either side. You need both candidates there. If this is a candidate, we need him there on his feet doing well. Full stop, right? You don't want someone to pass away in office. We don't, you know what I mean? And that's a real thing with COVID. You know that. It's a very real thing, especially at his age. And I wouldn't want that. I wouldn't want it like that. You know what I mean? That's what I'm saying. Exactly. Just to be clear.
Yes, sir. So we can ride with that.
Yeah. Now we get to other topics then outside of that, but I'll let that breathe. I'll let that breathe.
I'll take it.
Okay. So because and this is one of the reasons why I definitely want him there, the protests at the DNC from the people, especially Black America, I believe is gonna be heavy. I think it's gonna be heavy protests because of the Democrats' record, because of what the Democrats have done in Chicago, especially to the Black community. I was even debating whether or not I should go to the DNC to be part of the protest against the Democratic Party. I'm still on the fence, actually, whether I'm gonna go out there to be part of the protest, because I think it's a crucial moment in Black America, this Democratic National Convention, to put the message of Black people at the forefront. We need economics. We do not need any more symbolism. We do not need Ketanji Jackson Brown being appointed. We do not need Juneteenth, something that we were celebrating anyways. We need economics, in terms of economics directly to Black people. Economics in terms of how are you supporting Black people specifically, and not minorities or people of color. All of that language that was used to overstep. And I think that's part of the Democratic situation, that the people, Black people specifically, are changing in terms of their political acumen. They're no longer, too many of us are no longer accepting, well, the same old rhetoric of symbolism as a victory, because there was a time where that was, important, right? Where we weren't being represented at all. And then now I think we're taking the next step with transforming that. You have to put Black people issues on the table for many of the younger generation, or they're just not going for it. So I think it'll be a lot of protests. I don't know how much coverage in the national media that will get, but if I was in the Republican Party, I would highlight that. If I was on Fox News, I would highlight that, the protest, if it comes about. And if it doesn't, I'm not gonna lie, I will be very sad if the protests for Black people, if we don't have our Fannie Lou Hamer moment in this convention. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are, it would seem to me that the Black community would want to place those standards, not just on the Democratic Party, but on both political parties. It makes no sense to me that we would focus a demand so specific for our people on the one party that has made an effort to appease us at all. And the reason why I say that is because any type of policy initiative that is targeted specifically for African American people is going to be a difficult proposal for any candidate, any political party in this political atmosphere. The reason why Donald Trump was elected president and why he is able to run again as the nominee for the Republican Party is because there has been an upswell, a surge of white Christian nationalism in response to the presidency of Barack Obama. And so there is nothing that the GOP is offering African American people as an alternative to the limited policy points that the Democrats have. Admittedly, the Democrats don't have specific policies targeted directly towards Black people. I think that is because it is a political reality that is impossible at this particular point. I think one of the reasons why President Trump is so successful is because in the future, there is a time where the demographic shift in the nation, where the number of minorities are going to significantly surpass the number of white people in this country. There will be a day where reparations and policies that are specifically targeted towards minorities, including Black people, would be possible because the people would have the votes. And that is why they're seeking to, why they've gotten rid of abortion, why they are seeking to get rid of voting rights, why they're reducing education, and because they're trying to discourage the average person from voting. Because eventually, all of these things that are impossibilities and impractical now, in terms of demands and tangibles for Black people, they will be possible in the future. Not in our lifetime, because the demographics are not going to shift fast enough, right? But in the near future, I would say in the next century. And that is what I believe the far right, not those who are ideological conservatives, but those who have ulterior motives, who use that shield to hide their true plans. They're planning an alliance of global ethno-states, white global ethno-states. I think that is the plan. And I truly believe that Donald Trump is just a figurehead. It's just a figurehead. I don't think that's his philosophy. I think he's being used as a tool, just as every other president typically is. but there's a smaller group that's controlling him. And so back to the point, I think it's unfair for black people, or it's unwise, I should say, not unfair. I think it's fair to place those demands on the Democratic Party. But what I don't see from those who take that philosophy is, where are you demanding the same thing from the GOP? I think the reason why you don't see it is because you couldn't even get in the party, if that's what you were asking. Why weren't you considering going to the Republican National Convention and protesting? Because you would have been by yourself out there, brother. By yourself out there protesting for black rights at the RNC. It's just not happening.
It's just not happening at the DNC either, right? And so that's kind of the whole point of the thing, right?
Well, before I let you get away with that again,
I'm gonna let me finish my topic. I'll let you cook.
Wait a minute,
I'll let you cook.
we have to mention the funding for HBCUs. I just want to put that in there. That is a specific policy point for African American people, not Spanish people, not Asian people, not Indian people. And we don't want to bring that up as a policy point. And I don't understand that. But go ahead, my brother. Cook on.
No, I was just gonna say I'll let you cook. I didn't interrupt. I didn't forestall, and I had a lot to say about what you were saying in terms of pushback. And I don't want to go too far into this, because I do want to do a full show in which we do come off the cuff this week, in which we talk about the CBC, Democratic Party, and State of Black America, because I think we really do need to unpack that. Why do we feel so comfortable saying it's okay to not advocate for black people? And I think that is the crux.
I don't know anybody. I don't know any black people in the Democratic Party that are saying that.
I would disagree, but I would disagree because you even said it yourself. It's impossible to advocate specifically for black people.
Well, specific policies, but nobody's saying that. Nobody's successfully. I mean, that nobody.
Well,
let's take, for example, reparations, which is a tangible.
Hold on. Before we get into that, like I said, I don't want to have this conversation now. I just wanted to lay out a blanket statement in response to your blanket statement, and then I want to unpack this in a deeper conversation on the show for us. Does that make sense? That we talk about this specifically, and my unpacking is, I just think that's the difference between those who, where Black America is in terms of those who say you need to advocate for us specifically. We need those economic tangibles. And matter of fact, you're sitting back and you're advocating for people who can't even vote. And you're saying that they're more viable than us, the people you actually need to win an election. You need us to win the election. The Democratic Party is not a national party without black people. Full stop. They need that to get them over the hump. That's how they've been, and their attempts to cobble together a base outside of that has proven to be not as successful as they possibly would like. So the question is, where does black people stand in these conversations specifically? Right? And then I think we do need to take time where we just talk about that. We get into the debate. We get into the back and forth, and hopefully you guys stay locked in to join us. That's a little teaser, because it's gonna get heated.
Oh yeah,
it's gonna be lit. So please make sure you come back for that show. Let's do that this week, and then we'll come back with that so we could get that one in. So that's out there for us. Moving forward. We got the DNC coming up. We talked about that. We also talked a little bit about the culture wars let's talk about the culture wars that are happening.
Well, this is where the Republicans do have specific policy points that they're pushing. And that is, they're going to take away African-American studies throughout the nation. They're going to dumb down education, and anything that they perceive as anti-American is going to be removed from the classroom. And so they're going to take away Black history. And so I can't remember the name. I wish I had written down the quote, but there is a leader in the Republican Party that says one of the number one culture issues for the Republicans in the future is in education. And so they are planning to hijack the education system in this country and make it look like what it looked in the Jim Crow era because they are fearful of people finding out the truth of the racial history in this country. So that is what the GOP is planning. And frankly, the Democrats aren't doing enough to speak out against this issue because that's what's on deck.
I think I seen somewhere where it said black people were, or black Americans specifically, or ADOS specifically, were immigrants and not slaves. And you actually see that from the Democratic Party, where there's a lot of conflation of Black America and immigration, right? Where they say,
I haven't seen that.
Oh, I've 100% seen that, where they'll make a speech and they'll say immigrants built the country, or there's some stuff about immigration, and not speaking to Black America specifically, and how we were not immigrants. I seen something, and this is it for out of Texas. It was a while back, and there, a lot of the history books come from Texas, which was the Republican parties have been doing for a long time, of tailoring, like you said, the language. And it said, once again, Black people weren't slaves; they immigrated to this country, right? And that's the kind of stuff we'll see more and more of. But for me,
that's fringe. I haven't seen anybody that's a reputable Democrat use that type of language in describing Black people, that they immigrated to this country. What I've seen more than anything else on the Democratic side is a shift in the language from former slaves to enslaved people. And so that's the shift that I've been privy to. And so that must be anecdotal. I'm not saying that you haven't seen it at all, but I don't think that's a language shift that is a result of the leadership of the party, or anybody who is an elected official is speaking publicly and saying that Black people immigrated to this country, because that's just totally inaccurate. And so I would love to see some evidence that an elected official or some appointed representative or leader use that type of language in addressing Black people. Because if they do, I'll be the first to condemn that person for the use of that language.
I want to, like I said, I want to say this was during, because I got to think about it to find it. But I'm pretty positive it was an elected official.
But we can come back to that. That's not a big deal.
No, it's not the crux of it. But what is the crux of it is you're spot on with the culture wars and promoting culture. I think it's culture wars on both sides. I think.
Well, let me give it some foundation. Dr. Frances Cress Welsing was a noted psychiatrist who
was kicked out of HBCUs.
She was, but during that time she was able to write and teach, because my brother was a student at Clark Atlanta University and studied in class the ISIS Papers, which is one of her most famous works. And she talks about the agenda of white people and how basically these policies make sense if you put them in the context of they understand that it's a population game. And so white women, much like white people are on welfare more than any other group, white women are having more abortions than any other group of women in the country. And that is the reason why abortion has been outlawed, because the only way that our white brothers and sisters can remain the dominant population in this country is for them to eliminate the number of abortions that their white daughters are having. And the only way that's going to happen was to eliminate or outlaw abortion. And so that is one of the reasons why that happens. And so it all coalesces with the idea of reducing voting rights and restricting education and advancement for people, because it is about maintaining power, not maintaining a system of governance. And so for those group of people, and I don't think it's a majority of white people in this country, I think it's a small group of white people who have the power and the understanding to manipulate others, but that is their agenda.
What do you mean when you say the elimination of voting rights?
Well, like we have the Voting Rights Act. And so there's a movement on the conservative side not to pass again, I forget the technical term, but because it has to be recertified, I believe is the term.
Yeah, something like that.
Something to that effect. And so there's a movement to get rid of the Voting Rights Act. There's a movement across the nation to require identification and other items that could be viewed as litmus tests in order for citizens to vote. And so I think those measures are not intended to eliminate fraud, which we know from data that fraud is minuscule in this country. It's less than 1% fraud in national elections. And so there is no need for driver's license or other identification for people to vote. It's just another tactic to prevent people from voting. And so that is a part of a larger effort to maintain the power at the ballot, which is the key. And that's why you see many on the right professing they don't care about this nation and they're willing to go to war, because for them it's about maintaining power for their group of people more than it is a loyalty to a system of governance.
And I'm glad you bring that up. That what you just described is exactly why I say it's cultural wars on both sides, right? I don't know a black person who doesn't have an ID. I don't know a black person who can't go vote. And they conflate voter ID with, the Civil Rights Act. Those aren't the same things, right? In terms of, from my perspective, in terms of when black people came out, and I was a big part of it in 08, you knew I was out there, in terms of the black vote getting out. And we were able to vote in big, massive numbers because we were, like you said earlier, galvanized. We felt like we were voting for something. We felt like we were changed. So there was no issue in voting. We were more than happy to wait in line for hours and hours just to make sure that we casted our vote for Barack Obama. And it was a very real thing. But to conflate that with saying, I've even seen, and I've 100% heard this, oh, black people struggle to get IDs and stuff like this to go vote. Come on, man. It's disingenuous to push those ideas of the culture wars onto people.
I don't think there's any conflation. I think that's just the way I described the issues there.
No, but you're not the only one. You did it perfect. I'm with you.
No, because
I've heard that. I've heard that before.
There is no conflation. Those two things are separate, but they're part. What I was bringing in separate issues to contextualize a larger plan. The Voting Rights Act obviously comes well before this notion of voter identification. I think the voter identification is a more recent phenomenon that the right wing is pushing, not because there are a lot of black people. I think that's one of the myths that conservatives have, that black people won't be able to produce an ID when they go to vote. I think most black people who do vote have an ID. You know what I mean? So I think it's just the notion that they're discouraging people from voting, and they're willing to pass legislation that, although it may be ineffective, they're willing to pass it anyway because they're willing to do anything they can. And so when I mention the voter ID issue, I'm not mentioning it in terms of voter registration and being the same thing. It's another side of the coin in terms of trying to maintain the power of the ballot.
When we talk about the culture wars and where this country's at, I really want to jump into something you said earlier. When it comes to black people specifically, the right is absolutely firmly set of what white supremacy will look like going forward, right? So for them, it benefits black people. It benefits them as white society to not have abortions, but it also benefits black people, this lack of abortion. They say black people want these abortions. Black people is overrepresented in terms of abortion. We're overrepresented in terms of, welfare, right? Because of the lack of economic opportunity. There's been over 20 million black babies aborted since Roe v. Wade. And within any context, that is a genocide. That is 100% a genocide. But it's not put into that context in terms of how overrepresented the black population is. So for black people specifically, it wasn't bad that Roe v. Wade, from my perspective, was overturned. When we go back into what policies or the demographic shifts, because you talked about Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, peace be upon her. When we talk about her specifically, she stated about the demographic shifts earlier, but what's the interesting part is many of these Hispanic voters within their generation, and even some themselves, identify as white on their documentation all the time. The idea of a white Hispanic, and then within that next generation, they might just be white, and they vote in terms of that. We look at the Arab population, same way. many of them, especially from North Africa, when they come over here, they've been identified as Caucasian. Mexicans fought to be identified as white and have that ability to be identified as white. So what you have is, just like, from my perspective, just like the Italians were allowed into whiteness, we're going to reach a point where the quote unquote Hispanic race is going to be allowed into whiteness, just like the Irish were allowed into whiteness. So I think that is going to be the specific switch that we're looking at in the future. If you talk about just demographic shifts, what are your thoughts on that?
I think what you just described is a phenomenon that is cultural in Western civilization. Any group which immigrates to the West, the industrialized nations
that are not black.
Right. Well, no, I think the same thing happens for black people as well. Particularly if you look at African immigrants who come to this country, who tend to have their own contentious relationship with what we would call Black Americans.
Yeah. 100%.
Right. And so I think the phenomenon is, like you said accurately, within one generation of arriving in this country, there is a cultural shift that favors the Western perspective. I think you can go back and look at the works in the Harlem Renaissance of different writers like Charles Chestnut, who detailed passing, where African Americans who were fair-skinned, in order to achieve and experience some of the white privilege, passed as white. So I think that is
shout out to Meghan Markle.
Right. That is a fair comparison right there. However, I just think that ultimately it's not going to work, because when you trace Western civilization back to its roots lie in Europe. And in Europe, there are some hardcore racists who will not accept Spanish people as being Caucasian or white. They won't accept Italian people.
Shout out to the Moors, 700
Caucasian
years.
or white. And so I think that has a more positive effect on the minority population in America than it does in the origins of Western civilization, where the racism is hardcore. In Germany, they're not going to accept, Mexicans as white. And so I don't think that plan has a future in terms of establishing a global alliance. And I think, again, Russia, they're not going, Mexicans as brothers. And so, I think that strategy is limited. I think it's political in terms of trying to, again, maintain the power of the ballot.
Well, I would argue, especially you think of the Irish, you think of the Italian, you think of the white Hispanics, right? Yeah, they could be, you wouldn't even tell them apart, relatively speaking, within the generation, or not even, like right now. You go to Mexico, look at the president who was just elected the president of Mexico. She is firmly a white Hispanic. And there are many as such that you wouldn't tell apart. It's like almost like the same argument when people try to say Jews aren't white. If you don't know their background and heritage, to many of them, not all, to many of them, you don't know that they're different from any other white person, even though people like to claim different ideologies that make it, make them not be identified as white. But, if you look at it just from that perspective. So what I'm saying is, and kind of go back to this whole argument, there are so many culture wars, and it pisses me off, to be honest with you, that get away from the real arguments about the development of America and where America should go. In terms of, we are the richest country to ever exist in terms of resources available to us. But you walk through this country, you drive through this country from coast to coast, and you wouldn't know that. And that is the issue. Just look at, a place like Tampa. I was just in Tampa a few weeks ago, and I was down at the Riverside Walk, you know what I mean? And it's beautiful. Everything's being built. It's elite experience. Man, it felt good, especially to look across where I grew up in the projects, that was torn down, and rebuilt over there. But that's a drastic different experience to what's going on in East Tampa. And there are more places in America that's like East Tampa, and they have the rural versions of those same things, just like we have in Sefner, you know what I mean? Then there are versions, I don't know how much Sefner has changed, but just, the rural white experience. But there's more people like that who are struggling. And those are the policies that people aren't dealing with. They rather fight these culture wars instead of dealing with the fact that there's no health care, right? I just went to use my health care in Canada for the first time. I just walked in. Walked into a clinic, walked in, they said, all right, be back in a few hours because we got a long line. Saw the doctor, got some medicine, saw the doctor, was in and out, went to go pay for it. They're like, I use my health card. Like, no, that's covered. You have any pay. When I got that same prescription in America, I was paying over $150 and it was given to me. There you go. Right. And so those are the bigger issues that are the policy stuff. And I think that may be the crux of a lot of this conversation that we have moving forward is we're not dealing with policies. We're dealing with culture wars. And it's BS. If we put a culture war thumbnails up from here to the infinity, the channel will grow faster than if we put policy thumbnails up. And that's just a fact.
That is true. Well, elections are popularity contests. Yes. Until we develop an electorate that is sophisticated enough not to fall prey to these tactics, which includes misinformation on social media now, which I think is a large culprit for people who are undecided. I think the differences between the two parties are clear. I think the differences between the two sides of the culture war are clear, but there's so much misinformation for younger people and for people who are undecided or who don't pay attention to this on a daily basis, like you and I do, that it's difficult for them to make an informed decision. And so as a teacher, especially an English teacher, one of the things that I caution my students about is being able to discern for themselves. That is one of the skills that they have to develop. They have to understand argumentation so that they can see the pros, the cons, that they can make a decision between arguments and counter arguments and concession, refutation, so that they can make a more informed decision about who has their best interest in mind. And also, too, I think, which is not discussed enough, is sourcing. Where is this information coming from and who is sponsoring the source of this information, where they're getting their finances? Because although it's an old saying, it still holds true, follow the money.
But then that goes back to the point I made earlier about the donor class, right? The donor class are paying for these, on both sides, the Democrats and the Republicans are literally paying people to go and spew the rhetoric that they want them to spew. They're creating accounts. Sometimes they are creating bot accounts that speak the rhetoric they want to do. So now, let's say if you have somebody who comes and says a counterpoint, they're like, you're just a bot. They always even say that about ADOS. They're like, ADOS is just bots. They're Russian bots. They're not real people. Joy Reid was caught saying that on TV because they were advocating an agenda that the Democratic Party didn't want, right? For Black people specifically. This is the power of social media in a good way too, because you're getting messages out that isn't just the same thing from the talking heads at the top. So I think it's both sides of it, right? I think there is a positive to that.
No, I agree. I just, again, the way that argument is framed, I think it's illogical, because why would the Democratic Party take an issue that's a non-starter and then put it at the forefront of their platform when it's going to cost them seats and power, when the objective is to garner power? And so I think it would almost be akin to a football coach putting in a second team to get the experience that they need, because parents are saying everybody's not growing, but that the outcome is going to cost you a loss that's going to be detrimental to the season. And so again, and that's not even a good example, because at the end of the day, we know that the players would improve from playing, whereas just putting the issue out there is not going to make it more popular. But again, the difference in that analogy is the reparation issue is well known. So just putting it at the forefront of the platform is not going to inform more people about it. It's just going to cause more loss for the Democrats, which means more power for the Republicans, which means a reduction in the benefits that Black people have experienced. I come from a perspective of where we are not where we need to be, and the fight needs to continue. And that's well beyond the years that I'll be alive on this earth. But I think you have to acknowledge that there has been some shift in the experience for Black people in this country from its inception. We are no longer an enslaved people. That is factual. So if you want to make the argument that the removal of physical enslavement is not progress, then I don't really have a discussion, to be honest. If you want to say that we're still enslaved physically as well as mentally, then I don't think we have an argument. If you want to say that our mental enslavement is still as strong today as it was on slaves who were refused education, who didn't have the right to speak the way you and I are speaking right now, there's really no discussion, because we have factual differences that cannot be mitigated. we just see the world differently. So in that case, this podcast may not work. So this might be episode 2 on our last discussion on politics, because we just see the world so differently.
Yeah,
It's
no,
the
we
fact that we're
100%.
able- right. And so
No, we 100%
right.
see it differently, and that's okay too. No, just when you talk about the difference is, and I wasn't even going with that argument. I was just saying, just in general, the power of the donor class is to get away from allows them to get away from the arguments and to dive deeper into culture wars. I akin to the culture wars to like pornography. It's such a low level base thing that you can just connect to easier. And people are being designed to connect to that thing easier in that way, right? It's just like, you turn on the advertisement. I was walking down the street and there's this big billboard of this half naked lady that's just, being advertised to me just in my purview. I'm not even looking, I'm just walking down the street. But the billboards, it was multiple, were so large, a half naked man, you know what I mean? Chest out, all this stuff, but the billboards are so large and the advertisement is so low. I akin this to the same thing. And the only reason why I say in terms of slavery and advocacy, I do want to speak to those ancestors who took up the gun, and it was quite obvious that they'll say, historians, that the North might not have won if the black soldier wouldn't have picked up the gun and was able to fight, which was the significant turn in the war. So I do want to speak to the empowerment of how we did, in a large part, did the fighting to free ourselves. And, and that's definitely a pushback when you hear like that was our reparations. I'm like, nah, we did that. We picked up the gun. Gettysburg was in the North. It wasn't in the South. So yeah, no, we did a large part of that. So, but I do want to get into that argument. You keep pushing me back. You keep bringing me back to the topic. I'm trying not to have it right now, but I do want to have it. But you do want to have it too, because you keep pushing me towards it. But I'm not. I will stand back from it.
I told you we got to get it out the way, man, so we can get past it, man. We got to go ahead and duke it out.
Right?
We got to duke it out in front of everybody so they know, so they can take their side, and then we can continue on.
And then we can just go from there, because you keep pushing me towards it, and I'm like, all right, not yet. So that was definitely another teaser. Make sure you like and subscribe, because we're gonna come back with that this week. It ain't gonna be the first time, because we're gonna have to have multiple conversations. That's gonna be a long one. So, all right. So to wrap this up, this conversation, the RNC, and please check out our other podcasts that hopefully will be posted before this or after this. I don't know. I'll post them within a time block of each other. But either way, check out our post on the RNC. So I think we have to come back to the conversation about the conventions and really do a deep dive in comparison of the two. And I think that's going to be important. But going to the Democratic National Convention, will Biden be the candidate coming out? I think you've kind of clearly said you believe he will be. I'm going to agree that he's going to. I do want to agree, but his health is a big question in that, and how he deals with the COVID. I think they want to keep him in. I think he wants to stay in, but him catching COVID at this time, if he in fact did catch COVID at this time, which I do believe, but it's also, I seen too much of 24 and too much. What's the one with Washington, Kerry Washington, the other presidential one? I can't remember at the top of my head, but I seen too many of those movies where they give somebody a shot or something. They give them COVID or give them something, some kind of something.
I think you're talking about
scandal. Yeah, they give them something to move them out the way, right? So I don't put that past them, because COVID would be a great reason for him to step down, because we all know how real that is in his life. If he indeed has COVID, he is fighting for his life. Let's call it what it is. Especially at his age, he's fighting for his life. And we can't overlook that. And it could have been intentional. I'm not putting that past them. And I know that's not a conspiracy just to say that. With that being said, that's the only reason why I feel like coming out of that convention, it may be Kamala coming out of that convention. And that's why they're certifying the delegates while he's sick. And they're certifying the delegates, and it could be that's the way they're gonna go.
Right.
So but typically, yes, I think his wife wants him in. You saw how she came out after the debates. She's pushing him and driving him forward. His family's driving him forward to stay in this race. I don't think it's just him. And I think he really wants to stay in this race. But with that being said, I'm going to say, because he's sick, and I do believe, if you ask me, if you put I don't want to say gun in my head, but, if you push me on the topic, I'm going to say this could be all strategy to push him out, even though he doesn't want to come out, because he is fighting for his life. And if he doesn't make that decision, he may pass away in office, unfortunately, and that would suck. But it may be a thing, to be honest with you. What are your thoughts? On the RNC, the DNC, and then we'll push over from there.
Well, just to wrap it up, like I said earlier, I think the RNC did what they were supposed to do under the circumstances. I think you, without question, can say they had a successful convention. I think right now chaos is the word of the day for this time period going into the Democratic National Convention, obviously because of what we just discussed and the president's political position and now his health. And so I think it's up in the air. And so it's going to be fun to see what happens, in these next few days. And then obviously during the convention and where that leads us going into Labor Day, where traditionally, Labor Day will represent that final holiday where we go into a strong campaign season leading up to the election. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yep. We got a month out, so a lot can change between here and now. We do have August 19th is the Democratic National Convention. So thank y'all for joining us. We really appreciate it. J-Rob, preacher, teacher, I really enjoyed this conversation. It was great going back and forth with you and being on the same side at the same time.
Yes, sir.
Any last words?
No, please like and subscribe. I hope you enjoy the broadcast, and our purpose here is to educate as well as to entertain, but education first and for the upliftment of our people. And so with that much being said, I'm excited, looking forward to it, and y'all enjoy the rest of your day.
There it is. Peace, y'all.